She didn't take a single candlestick, a single spoon, or a single farthing that belonged to the family that had used her for 10 years. She walked out into the London fog with an empty purse and a full spine, believing she had lost everything. She had no idea that the most powerful man in the room had already decided she would be his wife, and that her escape was, in his eyes, simply the opening move of a war he intended to win. She thought she was running away. She was actually running straight into a trap built out of gold. Let me take you back to that night, because you need to understand exactly what kind of woman we're dealing with before you understand exactly what kind of man decided to chase her. Her name was Beatrice, 22 years old, an orphan baronet's daughter, and for 10 years the unpaid, unthanked backbone of a household that treated her like furniture with a pulse. She mended the gowns. She managed the ledgers her aunt was too idle to read. She negotiated with fishmongers and coal merchants and butchers, because someone in that house had to keep the whole crumbling operation from collapsing, and it was never going to be the people who actually owed her their comfort. That night, she was on her knees on a ballroom floor, pinning up the torn hem of her cousin's gown while 100 couples spun past her like she was invisible, which, as far as that family was concerned, she was. Her dress was 5 years old, mended twice, dyed a color specifically chosen to make sure nobody looked at her twice. It worked. Nobody looked at her, except one man. Across that ballroom stood a duke, 32 years old, obscenely wealthy, and carrying a reputation so cold that debutantes approached him the way you'd approach a wolf that hadn't decided yet whether it was hungry. He hated these events. He'd spent years avoiding them entirely, and yet for 4 straight weeks, he had shown up to every single one, standing in the shadows, doing something he never did. He was watching her, not the beautiful women, not the heiresses, her, the exhausted one with calluses on her fingers and dark circles under her eyes, the one who'd bartered a fishmonger down to a fair price in the pouring rain while holding an umbrella over a complaining relative who didn't deserve the courtesy. He'd noticed something. He was one night away from setting his plan into motion. And then, before he could cross that ballroom floor, her aunt found her. It happened in front of everyone. A missing diamond clasp, an accusation, a voice raised loud enough to make the string quartet falter. And Beatrice, who had absorbed a decade of exactly this kind of humiliation without ever once cracking, did something nobody in that room expected. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She looked at the woman who'd spent 10 years grinding her down and said, calmly, that the debt was paid, that she wouldn't be riding home in that carriage. And then she turned and walked toward the servant's door and disappeared into the London night with nothing but a small bag and a spine made of iron. The Duke reached that door seconds too late. Nothing left but rain and the faint smell of cheap soap. She was gone. And for the first time in his adult life, this man who controlled everything felt something close to panic. Here's what nobody tells you about walking away with dignity. Dignity doesn't keep you warm. It doesn't fill your stomach. Beatrice spent the next several days in a freezing boarding house in one of London's poorest corners, watching her small store of coins disappear, selling the one piece of jewelry she had left, her mother's locket, just to buy herself a few more days. She answered advertisement after advertisement. Governess positions, ladies' maid position, every door closed the moment she couldn't produce a reference, because the truth that she'd walked out on the family that had taken her in read to every proper household in London as instability, as trouble. She was proud. She was starving. And pride, as she was learning very quickly, is an expensive thing to hold on to when you haven't eaten in 3 days. Meanwhile, across the city, the Duke wasn't sitting still. He was in his study, systematically dismantling the family that had let her disappear. He'd bought up every scrap of her uncle's debt, £30,000 worth. He informed the man, in a voice so quiet it was worse than shouting, that he now owned him completely, and that if Beatrice came to any harm out there in the cold, he would not simply call on the debts. He would make sure that families' descendants were born into ruin. Then he sent men out into the city, every boarding house, every pawn shop, every employment office. Find her. But he didn't ride out himself. And this is the part of the story that tells you everything about who this man really was underneath the ruthlessness. He knew that if a duke showed up in a crested carriage offering rescue and a ring, a woman like Beatrice, proud, wounded, fiercely self-reliant, would refuse on principle. She'd see it as charity, as pity, and she would rather starve than accept either. So instead, on the fifth day, when a letter arrived for her at a dingy employment office, a letter from a wealthy, reclusive widow in a quiet part of the city, offering an absurdly generous salary to manage her household, Beatrice's instinct screamed that it was too good to be true. She got in the carriage anyway, because sometimes survival means walking toward the trap with your eyes open, because you simply cannot survive one more freezing night without it. She woke up the next morning in a room with fine linen sheets and plaster ceilings, warm for the first time in weeks. And here's where it gets interesting, because Beatrice was never, not for 1 second, actually fooled. Within days, she'd found the cracks in the story. Coal bought at impossible prices. A staff that moved with military precision instead of the shuffling disorder of an ordinary household. And in the widow's library, tucked on a high shelf, a book that smelled faintly of sandalwood and tobacco, the exact scent that had lingered in the carriage that brought her here. She knew exactly whose trap she was standing in. The Duke of Redbourne. And here's the choice that tells you who Beatrice really was. She didn't flee. She didn't confront him immediately. She simply decided, let the trap spring. She wanted to see his face when he realized she wasn't a mouse. So she ate the food. He came to her on a rainy Tuesday, soaked through, dropping the pretense entirely. And when he laid out exactly who she was, exactly what he'd done, and exactly what he wanted from her, she didn't flinch. She told him, flatly, that his coal prices had given the whole scheme away, that his widow forgot her limp whenever she got nervous. He laughed, genuinely laughed, like a man who hadn't allowed himself to be surprised in years. He told her plainly, he didn't want a frightened, compliant bride. He'd had his pick of those for years and wanted none of them. He wanted a partner, a woman who could negotiate down a fishmonger, catch a forged ledger, and tell a duke to his face that his lies were sloppy. And Beatrice, for all her fury at being cornered, understood something in that moment. She had two real choices: refuse and remain a companion in someone else's house for the rest of her life, invisible all over again, or take the offer and rewrite it on her own terms. She chose the second, and what she did with that contract is, honestly, one of the most satisfying things in this entire story. She read it 14 times. Then she took a pen, and she went through it line by line, crossing out every clause designed to keep her small. She struck out his steward's control over the profits of the estate he'd promised her. She refused to be bound to London for the social season on his terms. She added her own clause, a private quarterly allowance, entirely her own, answerable to no one. By the time she was done, the contract was bleeding red ink from top to bottom, and only then did she sign her name. When the Duke came to collect his answer, he read every single amended page in silence. Beatrice watched his jaw tighten as he found each demand, and she braced herself, certain she'd overplayed her hand, because men like him didn't accept terms. They dictated them. Instead, he laughed again, harder this time, and picked up his pen and signed his initials beside every single one of her amendments. I told you I wanted a partner, he said, not a sycophant. They married the very next morning in an empty church, with no flowers and no guests. Beatrice in the same plain gray dress she'd worn the night she walked away from everything, because the Duke had specifically asked her to wear it. He said it suited her, and when she arrived at his house, a fortress of white stone with 30 staff standing in rigid rows, the housekeeper made the mistake every single person in that story eventually made. She looked at this quiet, plainly dressed woman and assumed weakness. Within 4 minutes, Beatrice had dismantled that assumption completely. She noted the dust on the wainscoting, the frayed collar on the footman nearest the door, the improperly vented kitchen. She demanded the household ledgers, the wine inventory, and the master set of keys on her desk within the hour. The Duke, watching from across the hall, didn't say a word. He just smiled the smile of a man who knew, with absolute certainty, exactly what he'd found. Within weeks, That house ran with the precision of a warship. And when her aunt and cousin eventually showed up at the door, furious, ruined, demanding that Beatrice intervene with the Duke on their behalf, she didn't raise her voice. She simply told them the truth. The ledger between them was balanced. The debt, paid in a decade of unpaid labor, was settled, and she had them shown to the door. That night, alone with her husband, something shifted. He told her, for the first time, the truth underneath all his calculation, that he hadn't cornered her to own her. He'd cornered her because he recognized in her the same isolation he carried himself, buried under a lifetime of titles and transactions, and people who only ever saw the crown, never the man wearing it. He told her he didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want her submission. He wanted the one thing she'd never given anyone in her entire life, her trust. And Beatrice, who had built walls out of a decade of neglect, felt something in her finally soften. Not because he'd rescued her. He hadn't. She'd rescued herself every single day since she walked out that servant's door. But because for the first time, someone had built something specifically to stand beside her, rather than over her. Here's what stays with me about this story. Beatrice never once needed saving. What she needed was room. Room to negotiate, room to prove her worth on her own terms, room to walk into a fortress and make it her own. The Duke didn't hand her a happy ending. He handed her a contract, and she rewrote it in her own hand until it actually belonged to her. Maybe that's the real lesson here. The people worth building a life with aren't the ones who try to rescue you. They're the ones who hand you the pen. If this one hit you somewhere, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest for you. And if you want more stories like this, women who walk away with nothing and end up owning everything, hit like, share it with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.